The night Cassian Rourke decided he wanted her, Neva Holt was standing in the rain outside a pawn shop, trying to figure out if her mother's bracelet was worth enough to cover February rent. She didn't know that yet. She didn't know anything about him. She was 24 years old and had $17 in her checking account and a second job interview the next morning that she needed decent shoes for. The bracelet had belonged to her grandmother first, then her mother, and now it was going to belong to whoever walked in behind her. She didn't let herself think about it too long. Thinking too long about things like that was a luxury she stopped affording herself around. The same time she turned 21 and realized no one was coming to help. She went inside, she handed it over. She counted the bills the man gave her and thanked him and walked back out into the rain with enough for rent and a bus pass and not a single dollar more. She was 2 blocks from her apartment when the black SUV slowed beside her. She didn't look up. You learn not to in certain neighborhoods. You keep your eyes forward and your shoulders square and you walk like you belong wherever you're going, even when you're soaked through and your shoes are coming apart at the left sole. The window came down. Miss Holt, she stopped. She didn't want to stop, but something in that voice made her feet quit moving. Before her brain gave the order, she looked. The man in the back seat had gray at his temples and a jaw that looked like it had been set too hard, too many times, and eyes that were watching her the way people usually only watched things they intended to acquire. He wasn't looking at her with anything recognizable as desire or threat. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a problem he has already decided to solve. "Get in," he said. "I'll have someone bring you home when we're finished." "I don't know you," she said. "No," he said, "but I know you." She should have walked away. She knew that even as she was reaching for the door handle, but the rain was coming down harder now, and her rent was in her coat pocket, and she had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing about men like this wasn't what they did when you said no. It was that they already knew she wouldn't. She got in. His name was Cassian Rourke. She figured that out later, piecing it together from the way his driver spoke to him and the name on the building they took her to. A glass tower in the financial district that had no lobby sign and required a key card just to reach the elevator. The kind of building that doesn't want to be found on a map. He didn't speak during the ride. He sat across from her in the dark interior and looked out the window, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap and her wet coat dripping on the leather seat and didn't apologize for it. She had learned that too. Don't apologize for things that aren't your fault. When they got out, he walked ahead of her, and she followed because there wasn't another option she could see. And she was already building the map in her head. Lobby, 2 sets of doors. Elevator requiring keycard, 23rd floor, long hallway, corner office. The office was the kind of room that cost money to look like it cost nothing. Bare concrete and dark wood, and a single lamp in the corner that threw more shadow than light. He went to the window. She stood near the door. "Your father," he said, "owes me a significant amount of money." She kept her face still. "My father and I don't speak." "I know that too." "Then you know I can't help you." He turned from the window. In the low light his face was harder to read, but she thought she caught something there. Not cruelty exactly, more like resignation. The face of a man who had made up his mind about something and didn't particularly enjoy it. "Your father has been avoiding collection for 8 months," he said. "He's good at it. He's been doing it his whole life, from what I understand." She didn't say anything. She knew better than anyone how good her father was at disappearing when something was owed. "What I'm proposing," Cassian said, "is an arrangement." She waited. "You come to work for me 6 months. My household, my schedule. You'll be compensated well above what you're currently earning, which I understand is not very much." "You want me to work for you," she said slowly, "because my father owes you money." "I want a guarantee," he said. "Your father will surface eventually. He always does when someone he loves is involved." The word loves landed strangely. She thought about telling him that her father didn't love anyone, not really. Not the way the word was supposed to mean. But she thought about the $17 that were gone now, replaced by February rent and nothing else. And she thought about the bracelet, and she thought about the interview tomorrow, and how she was probably going to need 2 more interviews after that, before anyone actually hired her. 6 months, she said. 6 months, and when my father pays you back, you'll be free to go. He paused. You'll be free to go regardless after 6 months. That's the arrangement. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. He didn't fidget or soften or try to make it easier for her. She respected that reluctantly. "I want it in writing," she said. Something shifted in his expression. "Just barely." "All right. Tonight, all right." She didn't know what she was walking into. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself 6 months was nothing, that she had survived worse, that men like Cassian Rourke were monstrous in predictable ways, and predictable was manageable. She told herself she was doing the smart thing. She wasn't thinking about the way he'd said her name in the rain, or the fact that he'd known it at all, or the way he'd looked at her like he was already certain of something she hadn't decided yet. She signed the papers at midnight. She went home. She didn't sleep. His house was a 40-minute drive from the city. Not what she expected. She had pictured something deliberately intimidating. Gates, guards, architecture that announced its own importance. What she found instead was a property that sat back from the road and almost disappeared into the tree line. Old stone and dark windows, and the kind of quiet that felt chosen rather than accidental. The woman who let her in introduced herself as Gretch and immediately started walking, expecting Neva to follow. Gretch was somewhere in her late 50s and spoke in a clipped, efficient way that Neva recognized and appreciated. Not cold, just someone who had long ago stopped wasting words on things that didn't need them. "He's not here most mornings," Gretch said, leading her down a hallway. "Leaves before 6, back by 7 or 8 most evenings. He eats at the house maybe 4 nights a week. You'll manage his appointments, correspondence, any household matters that come up. If something requires a decision, you bring it to me first. If it requires him, I'll tell you. What happened to whoever did this before?" Gretch paused very briefly. She left. Neva let that sit. "Left as in quit or left as in?" "Quit," Gretch said firmly. "We don't have the other kind of drama here." There was something almost funny about the way she said it, and Neva found herself biting the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. Her room was at the end of the east wing, small but clean, with a window that looked out at the tree line and a radiator that worked. There was a closet with a few things already in it. Dark, simple clothes in roughly her size, and she stood looking at them for a moment before she understood what they meant. He had known she was coming before she said yes. He had made arrangements already. She put her own things in the dresser and left his in the closet. She didn't see him for the first 3 days. His presence existed in the periphery, a light on in the study past midnight, a coffee cup that appeared and disappeared, Gretch relaying instructions in that clipped way of hers. Neva did her job. She managed correspondence and rescheduled 2 meetings and dealt with a catering issue for an event the following month that she was fairly sure no one had been dealing with at all. She was good at logistics. She had been managing the details of her own life since she was 16. Other people's details weren't so different. On the 4th morning, she came down to the kitchen at 6 and found him there. He was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, actual paper folded in half, and he was reading with the focused, slightly removed expression of someone who had made peace with the early hours. She stopped in the doorway. She made herself not step back. He looked up. "Miss Holt," he said. "Mr. Rourke." He looked back at the paper. She went to the coffee maker. They existed in the same room for 6 minutes without speaking, and it was the most comfortable silence she had experienced in recent memory, which told her something about her recent memory that she didn't particularly want to examine. "Gretch says you fixed the Alderton event," he said. "It wasn't fixed yet," she said. "I just stopped it from getting worse." He turned a page. Same thing usually. She took her coffee and left before she said anything else. The thing about Cassian Rourke that no one had told her, and that she had not anticipated, was that he was not easy to dislike. She had expected cold. She had been prepared for it. She knew how to handle men who weaponized their own silence or used money as a way of making you feel perpetually small. She had met her father's friends. She knew the type. But Cassian didn't do any of that. He said what he meant and expected the same in return. And when he asked her opinion on something, he actually listened to the answer. He didn't explain himself to her, but he didn't pretend she was invisible either. He treated her like an adult who had agreed to a specific set of terms, and he held up his end of the bargain with a consistency that was, she didn't want to say surprising, but it was. She found out about him in pieces, not from him directly, from Gretch's careful non-answers, from the visitors who came to the house and the calls she was asked not to put through, and the way certain names made the energy in a room change. Cassian Rourke had built his company 15 years ago out of what the financial press called aggressive real estate acquisition, and what people in certain neighborhoods called something else entirely. He had grown up in South Baltimore with less than nothing, and turned nothing into a private empire that occupied 3 floors of an unmarked building downtown, and had enough fingers in enough industries that its actual shape was very hard to see clearly. He had never been married. He had a younger brother he didn't see, and a lawyer named Stowe who came every Tuesday, and a reputation that made men considerably more powerful than him very careful about what they said in his presence. He had, as far as anyone could tell, no friends. She asked Gretch about that once. Not directly. She said something like, "He doesn't seem to socialize much," which was true in the same way that saying Antarctica was cool was technically accurate. Gretch looked at her with that flat, assessing look she had. He socializes when it's useful, she said. Otherwise he doesn't bother. That sounds lonely. He doesn't seem bothered by it. Neva thought about that for a long time afterward. Her father called her in the third week. She was in the East Garden running through the event calendar when her phone buzzed with a number she hadn't blocked but hadn't spoken to in 2 years. She stared at it through 2 full rings before she picked up. "Baby girl," her father said, and her stomach turned the way it always did, because he had a voice made for radio and a soul made for very small spaces. "Don't," she said. "I heard you found yourself a new situation." She went still. "How do you know where I am? I know lots of things." A pause. A smile in his voice that had no warmth in it. "You got a good deal. Rourke takes care of his people." "I'm not his people," she said. "I'm here because of you." Details. She hung up. She sat in the garden for a while after that, her phone face down on the stone bench, and she breathed the way her mother had taught her when she was small. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The same thing her mother did every time her father came home with something broken that he expected them to fix around him. She didn't hear Cassian come out. He sat down on the other end of the bench without being invited, and didn't say anything and didn't look at her, and she was grateful for all 3 of those things in a way she couldn't have explained. After a while she said, "He called." "I know," Cassian said. "My people flagged the number." She absorbed that. "You're monitoring my calls." "The incoming ones from specific numbers," he said. "I told you when you signed the contract." Section 4, she thought back. He was right. She had read it and noted it, and filed it away as the kind of clause you expected and then apparently forgotten it. "He knows I'm here." That was the point. She looked at him. He was looking at the tree line. The late afternoon light was doing something unkind and beautiful to the angles of his face. "Was any of it real?" she said. "The job, the arrangement." He was quiet for a moment. "The job is real," he said. "You've been doing it. You're good at it." He paused. The rest was strategy. She waited for the anger. It was there somewhere, but it was slow to arrive, slower than she expected, and by the time it reached her it had lost some of its edge. "Strategy," she said. "Your father will come," he said. "He won't be able to help himself. You're the one thing he can't afford to lose, even though he spent 20 years acting like he can." She didn't say anything. "When he does," Cassian said, "I'll handle it, and then you can go. And until then, he said, "you work for me and you're safe, and no one touches you." She thought about what she wanted to say to that. She thought about the pawn shop and the bracelet, and the $17 and the rain, and she thought about the contract in Section 4, and the clothes in the closet that had been there before she arrived, and she thought about a girl in South Baltimore who had learned very young what it cost to grow up without anything protecting you. She didn't say any of it. "Okay," she said. He nodded once and went inside. She sat in the garden until the light was gone. The thing she was not supposed to do was start looking forward to the mornings. She did it anyway. Told herself it was the coffee, the quiet, the particular quality of the early light through the kitchen windows. Told herself it had nothing to do with the fact that he was reliably there before 6, and reliably not unpleasant to be around, and occasionally said things that caught her sideways in ways she wasn't expecting. He had a dry humor that came out when he wasn't being careful. She discovered this by accident, 3 weeks in, when she made a comment about the catering company's invoice, and he said something so precisely cutting about their portion sizes that she laughed before she could stop herself. He looked at her when she did, briefly, with an expression she couldn't read, and then he looked back at his paper. She replayed it more times than was reasonable. She was not supposed to be doing any of this. She was here because of her father. She was here because she had $17 and no other options. And a man with gray at his temples had slowed his car beside her and said her name like he already knew the answer to a question she hadn't heard yet. That was all. She was not supposed to notice the way he stopped what he was doing when she walked into a room. Just for a second. She was not supposed to think about Section 4 of the contract, and what it meant that he had wanted to know when her father called. She was not supposed to find the control of him, the absolute deliberate chosen stillness, somehow less frightening and more like the most genuinely honest thing about him. She noticed all of it. She thought about all of it. She told herself she was just being thorough. The 4th week, someone followed her into town. She noticed the car because she noticed things like that. Her mother had been a woman who paid attention to her surroundings and had passed the habit down to her daughter out of necessity. 2 turns the same direction meant traffic pattern. 3 meant something else. She didn't panic. She went into the pharmacy she'd been planning to go into and texted Gretch a description of the car and its plate and continued shopping like she wasn't calculating exits. By the time she came out, the car was gone. In its place, half a block down, was one of Cassian's people. Just standing there. just letting her know. He was home that evening when she got back, which was unusual. He was in the study with Stowe the lawyer, and he came to the door when he heard her and looked at her once the way he did, taking inventory. "You're all right," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I'm fine," she said. "I handled it." Something happened on his face, fast and small and then gone. "I know," he said. "Gretch told me." She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed for a while, and thought about the look on his face and the way he'd said "I know." And she thought about all the things she was still telling herself this wasn't. Her father showed up on a Tuesday in the 6th week. She was in the kitchen when Gretch came to find her with that particular expression. That meant something had happened that wasn't in the plan. She went to the front room and her father was there in the entry hall, older than she remembered, smaller, wearing the same performance of himself he'd always worn. The easy smile, the "I just happened to be in the neighborhood" posture, the eyes that were already calculating. She looked at him. She didn't move. "Neva," he said. "You look well." "Leave," she said. "I came to talk. I've heard you talk." She crossed her arms. "I've heard you talk my entire life. I think we're done." He started something about old times and she didn't let him finish it. She said clearly, "I'm not a bargaining chip, Dad. I'm not a strategy. I'm your daughter and you used me the same way you've used every single person who ever made the mistake of caring about you." He flinched. She saw it. It was the first time she had said something that reached him, and she had been talking to him for 24 years. She became aware that Cassian was behind her, just inside the hallway. She hadn't heard him come in, but she felt the shift in the air. Her father's eyes moved past her, and something in his face changed. The performance slipped, and underneath it was something tired and much less interesting than the mask. "Rourke," her father said. "Mr. Holt," Cassian said. Whatever happened next, she didn't witness all of it. Cassian said something to her. "You don't have to be here for this." And she thought about arguing and decided she didn't have to. She went to the east garden. She breathed in for 4 and out for 4, and watched the tree line and listened to the birds, and did not think about the sound of her own voice saying things she had never said out loud before, and how strange it felt to have finally said them. He found her an hour later. "It's handled," he said. She nodded. "You don't have to stay," he said. "The arrangement, I know." She looked at him. "I know what the arrangement says." He was quiet. "I've been here 6 weeks, she said. "The contract says 6 months. He said nothing. In his stillness she had learned to read the things he didn't say, the way you learn to read any landscape you've been living in long enough. "Unless you want me to go," she said. He looked at her. He held her gaze with the same directness he held everything else, and she thought about all the ways she had categorized this man in the first week: cold, controlled, frightening, strange, and how inadequate every single category had turned out to be. "No," he said. "Just the word. Just the one." She looked back at the trees. He sat down on the other end of the bench, the same end he always chose, she'd noticed, leaving room, and she thought about what it cost him to say something that's simple and clear in a life that had apparently trained him to never say anything simple and clear. She thought about what it had cost her, standing in that entry hall, to say things she'd rehearsed for years and never managed to get out. She thought maybe the two of them were not so different after all. "Tell Gretch I'll be in for dinner," she said. The silence that followed was the warmest thing she'd ever sat in. She stayed. Not because of the contract. The contract stopped mattering somewhere around the 7th week, and by the 8th week she had stopped counting weeks at all. She stayed because the mornings were real, and the coffee was real, and the look on his face when he thought she wasn't watching was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a person who had built an entire life out of not being unguarded. She stayed because Gretch started leaving her seat at the kitchen table and calling it her seat in the way that people do when they've decided something about you. She stayed because one morning he came down and there was a newspaper already folded at her elbow, folded to the section she always read, and he didn't mention it and she didn't mention it, and they both pretended it was nothing. She knew what it was. It took another 3 weeks for him to say anything. She would have waited longer. She had been waiting her whole life for something to come from effort rather than accident, and she had learned to be patient. But he was not a man who said things in pieces, and apparently once he decided, he didn't let it sit. He found her in the East Garden again. It was becoming a theme. He sat on his end of the bench and she looked up from the calendar she'd been not really reading for 20 minutes, and he said, "I want you to stay." She waited. "After the 6 months," he said, "not as an employee." She looked at his face. The jaw that looked like it had been set too hard too many times. The gray at the temples that she had stopped thinking of as older and started thinking of as his. The eyes that were watching her with the same directness they always had, without performance, without strategy. This time what she saw in them was nothing like a man assessing a problem. "You're not good at this," she said. "No," he agreed. You're going to need to say it differently." He looked at her for a long moment, then, "Stay, Neva," her name, just her name. The first time he had used it, she thought about the rain and the pawn shop and the $17 and the bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother and her mother. Before, it belonged to whoever came in after her. She thought about the contract in Section 4 and the clothes in the closet that had been waiting before she arrived. She thought about being 24 years old and learning to be done with things that didn't deserve her. She thought about a man who had slowed his car beside her in the rain and known her name before she'd given him a reason to. "Ask me again in the morning," she said. He looked at her. "You're always there," she said. "In the morning, I want it to be. I want it to feel like a choice I made when I wasn't wet and cornered." Something moved through his expression, and it was almost, the thing she'd been learning to recognize. "All right," he said. The next morning she came down at 6:10, and he was at the counter, and there were 2 cups of coffee already poured, and when he heard her come in he didn't turn around. He just said, "Well," she picked up her cup. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned the page on his newspaper and said, "Good." She sat down across from him and drank her coffee, and the house was quiet around them, and the light came through the kitchen window at the angle she had learned to count on. And it was not the romantic story she would have written for herself at 24. It didn't have the shape she'd been given to expect by movies or her mother's hopeful remarks, or the way people talked about love, like it was something that arrived with music under it. It had the shape of 2 people who had both learned that most things worth keeping required you to choose them more than once. In the rain, in a signed contract, in a garden, over a newspaper, in the morning when it still felt real. She chose it, she kept choosing it, and the bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother and her mother, and then briefly to someone else. Cassian found it 3 months later and set it on the kitchen table without saying a word about how he'd done it, or what it had cost him, and she picked it up and turned it over in her hands and looked at him across the room. She didn't ask, he didn't explain, she'd put it on, and that was enough. And the morning went on around them like it always did, quietly, without ceremony chosen.